This is Bob Hoover of North American Aviation, who always gives a tremendous display of precision flying with his North American P-51.
Bob Hoover. He used to be a test pilot, one of the best. Today, he's manager of customer relations for North American's Los Angeles division, and he's the man who demonstrates this plane.
I never felt that I was any better than any other pilot. I just felt this is what I want to do, and I want to do it to the best of my ability.
If you're interested in or involved with aviation, you'll likely know something about Robert Anderson Bob Hoover. Yet he did so much and touched so many during his long life and career that even his admirers might be surprised at all that he did. On the other hand, if you're not familiar with the history and evolution of American aviation, there really is no quick way to describe the true American hero, the authentic national treasure known as Bob Hoover. My name is Sean D. Tucker. I have flown thousands of performances as an airshow pilot. It's likely I'm alive today because of the lessons and the warnings I've received from my friend Bob Hoover. And by the way, I could introduce you to a banquet hall full of people who will tell you the same thing.
Start curtain right now for the POW Nazi! Okay, here's a fun one. It's a holy hot fire. Right rudder, left A-rod, forward stick, let's go!
The immortal aviation pioneer, Medal of Honor recipient, and Air Force General Jimmy Doolittle once called Bob the greatest stick and rudder man that ever lived. I don't know, but I'd take Jimmy's word for it. Bob was certainly the best I ever saw. But there is no Bob Hoover elevator speech. I can't tell you he was the first pilot to solo across an ocean nonstop, or a combat fighter ace. He wasn't the first pilot to exceed the speed of sound, or to walk on the moon. But I can tell you that Bob Hoover had the complete respect and admiration of the pilots who did those things. They knew that Bob Hoover not only possessed a transcendental gift for flying airplanes, but also a set of core values that invariably drove him to do the right thing for his fellow pilots, for his employer, for his country, for aviation. I was honored to be one of the celebrants of his memorial service when he left us in late 2016. I'll admit, I didn't always understand all the dimensions of Bob Hoover's gift. It took me a while to completely grasp all that Bob Hoover knew about flying and all that he had done in his life, a life that was so inspired, so courageous, and so fully lived that if you proposed it as a book or a movie, it would probably be rejected for being too far-fetched. But I can assure you that Bob's life and Bob's gift were real. They were as real as it gets.
It was during the Depression era, of course, when I grew up, and my father had to work at 2 jobs in order to put food on the table. As soon as I was old enough, I had to start earning my own money just for lunches and at school and any spending money I wanted. And when I got to 16, I got a job in a grocery store on Saturdays, and as a result, I earned $2 a day. And if I got any tips for carrying out groceries, that would be another 15 or 20 cents. And I was so enthused about aviation, I'd been building model airplanes, and even some that you could fly with a rubber band. And when an airplane would fly over, I'd run outside and look at it. It wouldn't be very often, but it was a big thrill to me to see an airplane fly. And then I'd ride my bicycle to the airport, and it was quite a ride. And then I would get 15 minutes flying time, so it took me for a long time to get enough hours to solo. And then once I soloed, I fought nausea throughout the whole time frame. Just absolutely sick every time I'd get in the air. So I had to overcome that. But I kept pushing myself right into the threshold of nausea every flight, and I'd keep doing it until I got over it, and then I went to something else. And at 18, when I graduated, I already knew what I wanted to do, and I'd already learned to fly. And I had encountered every obstacle you could find about not being able to fly. I found out my eyes were weak, and I also found out that I had nausea, air sickness every time I got off the ground. My first flight, that was devastating to me because I dreamed of nothing else. And I decided that I was not going to accept that I could not do what I really wanted to do, and that was to become a pilot.
I was not going to accept that I could not do what I really wanted to do. Time and time again, throughout his life, Bob's resolve to speak and act according to his own conviction put him at odds with authority and often in very real physical danger. At the same time, that determination had everything to do with his greatness as an aviator and an American. Bob Hoover was 18 years old in 1940. He graduated high school that spring. College was never a consideration. He was laser-focused on his dream of flying. In the Tennessee of that era, with money tough to come by, the most probable pathway to the cockpit for Bob Hoover was to join the Tennessee Air National Guard.
By the time I joined, I was 18, I was in the service, and as an enlisted man, as a gunner, thinking that if I joined the Air Guard, and that's what I did, that the pilots would probably give me some stick time, which they did. They were very generous.
Flying time, stick time as pilots call it, is everything to a new pilot. Bob Hoover was a young man who had done every job he could from the time he was 12 years old, delivering newspapers, stoking coal furnaces, stocking grocery shelves in order to get stick time.
I decided I'd start experimenting with maneuvers, and I started teaching myself acrobatics. And I just thought, well, if the airplane will roll what if you stopped it here and here like this? And so I started working on that. It didn't bother me. And I did it to 8 points. Then I went to 16 points. And I was doing inverted maneuvers.
This self-designed training program yielded an interesting result when Bob began flying in the National Guard.
So I went off to flight training, and I got there and got my first check ride. This instructor said, I'd like to show you a slow roll. Is that okay? And I said, yes, sir. And he did one, and he said, would you like to try it? And I said, yes, sir. Boy, he said, you can do it as well as I can. He said, what else can you do? So I did this for him, and he looked at me, in the mirror and shook his head. We got on the ground, and he went into the commandant's office, and he said, sir, I've got a problem. And the commandant said, well, just go ahead and wash him out if he's a problem. He said, you don't understand. He can fly better than me or anybody I've ever seen fly. Next thing I know, he called me in, the commandant did, and he said, I want you to give check rides to all of the instructors. And so the whole time I was in primary, I didn't learn anything. I was teaching. Finally, they lowered the age from 21 to 18 for pilot training. And my commanding officer said, all the pilots say you've got a lot of skill, young man, and you don't have to go to flight training. We'll just commission you right here, and you can fly all of the airplanes.
But for young Bob Hoover, that wasn't quite enough.
I think we've got storm clouds over Europe and I believe someday we're going to be in a conflict of war, and if we are, I want to be out there fighting. And if I accept the commission here, I'll have an O in my wing shield, and that means observation pilot, and you cannot fly combat. And I had wanted to be a fighter pilot in the worst way. And so I asked him, I said, sir, could you get me an assignment to flight training so I could be qualified for combat? And he said, well, of course I can.
Bob had vision problems all his life. He wore fairly thick glasses for as long as I knew him. But to be a fighter pilot in World War II, you needed to begin flight training with 20/20 vision. If your vision degraded during training, you might be allowed to fly with corrective lenses, but not to start with. Once again, Bob's gift provided the way around an obstacle. The flight surgeon who would test his vision had seen him fly.
And he said, all the Air Guard pilots tell me how skilled you are. And he said, I want you to pass this exam, but I'm concerned that you're going to have to work awful hard to get it. So he was trying to clue me. Sergeant, he said, I've got a couple of things I've got to do in my office. And when I come back, I want you to read that bottom line for me. So he gave me about 30 minutes to memorize the letters and 2 lines, the 2 lower lines that I couldn't read. It's sort of an interesting thing. I went through the same flight training as a cadet did. And when we graduated, I was still a sergeant. And all the rest of the people were officers, and they didn't have any experience like I had at all, but here I was a sergeant, and when we went into fighter training, I was made a flight leader just right off. Well, then about a month later, my commanding officer called me in, and he said, I'm putting you in charge of 67 fighter pilots, and you're headed for England.
Now his country needed defending, and he had managed to become a trainer of trainers. He could barely contain himself.
I was enthusiastic. I had high ideals and expectations because I had learned a lot of things about aviation that other people had not had an opportunity to do.
But Bob had another obstacle to overcome. The Army Air Corps' plan for him did not include flying combat.
We got to Africa, and when we arrived there, I was the first to get an assignment. And boy, I was just anxious to go. And I checked into where I had to check into, and they said, we're separating you from your men, and you're going to be testing airplanes, taking them up for their first time. They're coming overseas in ships, and we've already got 2 shiploads waiting now to be assembled. And when they get them assembled, you're going to fly them around and check them out until they're ready to go to combat. I said, boy, I wanted to go to combat. We had a few translators who were French, and they could communicate with them, and we had some people that could communicate with the French. Well, that's a hell of a way to build an airplane. And they assembled these airplanes, and I tell you, it was death-defying. Every time I flew, there'd be something wrong drastically, and I'd have to fly the same airplane sometimes 6 or 8 times to get rid of all the squawks to make sure that it was ready to go into combat. That was with P-40s and P-39s.
Though disappointed at not being in the fight, Bob took to the flying as he always did.
Every time I fly, even to this day at my age, I want to do it better than the last time I was in that airplane. And I try to be more precise, whether it's aerobatics, keep my hand in with all phases.
Loyalty was a watchword with R.A. Bob Hoover. His friends, his fellow pilots, the Air Force, his country. Anyone or anything who mattered in Bob Hoover's life could count on his unfailing loyalty. Probably no one knew that better than his friend and fellow Air Corps pilot, Tom Watts.
Tom and I took 2 new airplanes with external tanks and went around the enemy territory to get to Tulergma. And we signed off the paperwork, and we were planning on waiting for a C-47 to pick us up. The colonel in command of that fighter group said, we've got 2 airplanes that have a lot of battle damage, but they're okay to fly, but not okay to go into combat with. Tom said, if the engines check out okay, let's go for it.
But Tom's airplane quickly developed a problem.
Bob, I've got a rough engine. I looked over, I could see little puffs of black coming out of his exhaust stacks. And I said, Tom, do you see that little plateau over there on the top of that mountain? And he said, yes. I said, that's the only chance you've got. I said, or else you'll bail out and we'd never find you in these mountains. And I said, why don't you take a look at it and make your decision? And so he looked at it and he said, I'm going for it. And he got down and got stopped.
Bob later wrote, I knew Tom would never have left me in a similar situation. I was determined that we'd either both make it back or neither one of us would. Tom Watts later wrote, he pulled around and dragged the field, then his gear moved down slowly and locked. Was this damn fool gonna land? He did, and it was a beauty. He brought his ship over alongside of me. My buddy wouldn't leave me. The P-40s Bob Hoover and Tom Watts were flying were single-seat planes, and only Bob's was flyable. Bob somehow flew both of them home with an open canopy.
We tried to squeeze him in, and I took my parachute off and just used the parachute as a seat cushion so I could see out adequately. And he put his feet down in here like this on the sides of the seat, and then leaned over, and this much of his head over here, this much was sticking out in the wind. You couldn't close the canopy. And my face was against the gun sight. Well, I took off, and I decided we couldn't get above 140 knots because he's going to be in the wind with his face. And he had his eyes protected and his little leather helmet on. And we were looking good on the fuel for making it. But it was a miserable experience for, I suppose 2 hours. My face pressed against the gun sight, and his mouth was torn back through the corners of his lips here from the wind catching his mouth when he'd try to say something. And we got there, and it was almost dark. I said, I've got a Mayday, and explained the situation to the controller, and we went in, and they cleared the field because I didn't know if I was going to be able to land it because I was slid down in the seat too, and I didn't know if I had enough room to pull the stick or if I could see well enough. And I was really planted against that head, that gun sight. And we got on the ground and taxied in okay. And I looked at his face, and boy, I couldn't believe it. And he said, look at yours when you get a chance. I was black and blue from that gun sight on the side of my face. Well, he was black and blue the next day, and we were two happy clowns. But that to me was the most outstanding thing that I did in World War II.
Remember, Bob had refused the offer of automatic commission as a flight officer because that kind of commission would have left him unqualified for combat. And combat was his goal from the beginning. In the course of doing his job in the Ferry Command, specifically delivering new P-40s to a fighter unit, he took his destiny into his own hands.
Got all 6 P-40s on the ground safely, and I went into the tent to do the paperwork, and they were putting all of their gear into the B-25. And a 2-star general, I looked up, and there he was, and he said, young man, I'd like to talk to you about your mission. And I said, sir, I came into this Air Force to fly for our country and fight the enemy. And I said, I had a taste of it in England. And each assignment I've had since has had nothing to do with combat. And I said, I think I'm as qualified to be a good fighter pilot as anybody could be. I said, I can hit the target consecutively, right side up or inverted. And I said, I can hit a target out of 4 consecutive loops. And that means every loop has to be perfectly round to be in position to fire in the target each time you come through. And it's very difficult. Most people do loops and they're sort of L-shaped. You move out. And he listened to me and he said, young man, he said, that's a hell of a story. He said, if you can really fly that well. And I said, well, sir, you could contact Colonel McNichol because he's watched me do these demonstrations I do. And I said, he told me if I could ever get a transfer that he'd make me a flight leader if I could get an appointment to his outfit. And he's in the 52nd Fighter Group, he commands it. He said, son, you'll have your orders within 2 weeks.
But things weren't quite that simple. Perhaps they never are, but then again, this is Bob Hoover we are talking about.
Nothing happened. Weeks went by, nothing happened. And I was getting other assignments, and I was just down in the dumps in the worst way. And finally this sergeant called me, and he was a clerk for this Colonel Epwright, whom I reported to as head of ferry command. He said, "Mr. Hoover, your orders have been on the colonel's desk since you went on that trip to Sicily." And he said, "I asked the colonel when he was going to tell you about it. And he said, I'm not going to tell him about it. I'm not going to let him transfer. I'm going to keep him right here." I picked up the phone and I called the colonel. And I said, "Colonel, I just had a phone call from headquarters, fibbing." And I said, "They wanted to know why I hadn't reported for duty in Sicily." And he said, "Because I'm damn well not going to let you go." He said, I cannot operate this thing without you." And I said, "Well, sir, I'm really disappointed you feel that way." And he said, "Well, you've got to get that in your head that you're not going to be able to get transferred." And so I said, "Well, thank you, sir." And my next flight was to Palermo, Sicily with Spitfires to the 52nd Fighter Group.
Yep, you guessed it. Once he got to the 52nd Fighter Group, knowing the general's orders were in fact sitting on his boss's desk, he had no intention of returning to the ferry command.
I put my footlocker in the back of the airplane, and I took two co-pilots I'd been training to be a pilot on the B-25, and I had led Spitfires, 6 of them, into Palermo, Sicily. And when I got there, I said, "Fellas, you're on your own." And I took my footlocker out of the airplane, and I asked someone on the line to take me over in a Jeep to the colonel's office. And boy, he put his arms around me and he said, "Oh, I've been hoping this day would come." And he said, "I've told all of the people in this fighter group about your expertise." And he said, "I want you to put on a show for all of them." And so he brought all the 3 squadrons were located in different places into Palermo. He got everybody assembled, and he said, "You're going to see something you've never seen before. But I want you to know one thing. If I catch any one of these you fighter pilots trying to duplicate what you're going to witness, I'm going to have you grounded."
Bob Hoover believed, his bosses believed, and those who saw him fly fighters in those days believed he was simply the best there ever was, which makes what happened to him in combat all the more surreal.
The day I was shot down, we were dive bombing some transports, feeding supplies to the Germans in southern France there. And we were attacked by 4 Focke-Wulf 190s. And we just pulled off of the target of releasing our bombs, and we were all split up. I pulled out of a break like this, and I was up about almost 90 degrees, and I saw this Focke-Wulf out here, and I just ignored him. And about that time, I was hit. And believe it or not, it was a 90-degree deflection shot. Well, I knew I had no choice. The fire was so bad, I just rolled it upside down, and I hoped that they wouldn't hit me again. And I just rolled it upside down and fell out, hit the water, got tangled up in my parachute lines. And then I sat there in the water, and I had shrapnel that came all through the bottom of the airplane. And I was in the water all afternoon, and a German Corvette was searching for 2 of their pilots that had gone down, and they found me. And I remember for as long as I lived trying to sink my escape kit because I didn't want the Germans to catch it. I'm sure by then they must have had hundreds of them. But it was a little encasement that had a little saw blade encased in rubber, which you inserted in your rectum. And it had a map, a cloth map of the area we were fighting in. And it had some chocolate bars, some other things that could keep you from severe pain. It was a Corvette, and it had like a ladder coming down with a platform on the bottom right near the waterline. So finally they had a long pole with a hook on it, and they hooked me and pulled me onto that platform.
Being a prisoner of the Germans was a new reality for Bob, but it didn't change him. It just gave him a new set of objectives.
They took me off and put me in a dungeon, and I lived with the rats for the next day or so. And then they took me out for interrogation. They took me to a real fine hotel that was a billeting spot for all the German officers in that area. And the families were with them in some cases, and they tied me up on a big column in the lobby with my hands behind me like this, and the wives would come by and spit on me and slap me. And I did understand why, because so many of them had lost their families and their homes in the bombings that we were doing, and I endured it. Of course, I was mad and a hornet at the time it was happening, but as I reflected on it, well, I had the wrong attitude. I wanted to escape, and I never quit trying till the day I did.
Bob endured 16 months in that camp. He repeatedly tried to escape, but was caught, beaten, and put in solitary each time. But gaining his freedom was now Bob's focus. And I believe determination was the engine that drove Bob Hoover in every circumstance of his life. Bob was in that camp so long that the Allies had nearly defeated Germany. In fact, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces in Europe, issued a new order to pilots and airmen being held in German prison camps. It told them to stop risking their safety with escape attempts because they would shortly be liberated anyway. But again, this is Bob Hoover we are talking about.
I ignored that. I kept right on attempting to escape because I wanted out. The war in Japan was still going on, and I wanted to get in on that. The day I got out, I got a diversion going. I got some of the fellas that I'd worked with on some of the escape attempts to start a fight. And once they started the fight, got all the guards' attention, but half of the guards had deserted by then. We could hear the big guns about 50, 70 miles away. And we got to the other side, and now we were away from the Germans for the most part, out in open countryside.
After 3 days on the run in Germany, a very hungry Bob Hoover and his fellow escapee came to a farmhouse occupied by the wife of a German officer. Her husband was based elsewhere. Luckily, she spoke English. In exchange for some food, Bob wrote her a letter to give to the advancing Allied troops. The letter asked the Allies to treat her kindly because of the help she had provided him. As he was leaving, she also gave him a pistol. Bob was on the hunt for a German airplane he could use to fly himself to the Allied lines and freedom. As he continued to move around the German countryside, he was in and out of the lines of the Russian troops. The Russians were vengeful enemies. Bob witnessed unspeakable brutality inflicted on Germans by the Russians. Eventually, Bob made his way to a deserted airfield and started looking for an airplane.
Finally, I found one that was full of bullet holes, but the engine was okay, and it was full of fuel. And I said, I'm going to wait till a mechanic walks by here, and I'm going to put the gun on him and bring him in here and help him get the airplane started. And so finally, a German mechanic did come by, and I pointed the gun at him and yelled, and I motioned for him to come into the revetment, and he walked in there. And boy, he put his hands up, and his face was just pale as a ghost.
The Germans showed Bob how to start the Focke-Wulf 190 airplane, and Bob decided it would be too risky to taxi the airplane slowly out to a runway. He simply firewalled it out of the revetment where it was parked.
Well, I let it go, and I went straight out of that revetment, got airborne, got the gear up, and there was a 4,000-foot ceiling. And I no more than got off the ground, and I started thinking, you know, this is the dumbest thing you've ever done. Here you are in an enemy airplane, and the war's not over, and our Air Force people come in and see you. They're going to take an easy pot shot at you, and you're dead. And I headed north till I got to the North Sea. Then I swung west, and I thought, if I've got enough fuel to get to Holland, I'll see windmills, and I'll know I'm in safe country.
Bob had eventually landed the German airplane in a field in Holland. What he had no way of knowing was that under Nazi occupation, the Dutch population had experienced the highest per capita death rate of any country occupied by Hitler's forces. Now that they had been liberated, the local population was not likely to warmly welcome a pilot who had emerged from a German airplane. He was immediately surrounded by farmers with pitchforks and other weapons. They were marching him down a road when they encountered a British convoy. Bob was able to describe his situation to them, and the Brits intervened.
It was sort of a hair raiser and a very dumb thing to have done. You know, the war was practically over, but all I'd thought about every day, all day long, was getting out and capturing one of their airplanes, and I was so motivated.
The day Bob Hoover stole that German airplane and flew himself to freedom, he was 23 years old. The war in Europe was within months of being over when Bob escaped. Plans to turn our attention to the Pacific and Japan became moot with the atomic bombings of the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6 and 9, 1945. After getting home, Bob wrote, I'd spent nearly 2.5 years overseas. It was an experience I'll never forget. I had seen the extremes of bravery and brutality, of kindness and cruelty, of loyalty and cowardliness. Above all, I knew more than ever what it meant for one to lose that precious gift of freedom.
When you first lose your freedom, and I've said this to so many young people, you don't know what we have here in this country till you can't see that red, white, and blue flag. You don't know what that stands for. That's freedom.
Air Force films of the Army's newest fighting plane, the jet-propelled P-80 Shooting Star. The P-80 is believed to be the fastest fighter in existence. The secret of its spectacular speed lies in the new knife-edged wing and its powerful kerosene-burning jet engine.
World War II was the dawn of the jet age. Few inventions have done more to shrink the geographic and cultural distances between peoples than the jet engine. We are now in our third generation of people who take the speed, reliability, and comfort of jets for granted. In part, we can thank Bob Hoover for that. Bob Hoover became a U.S. Air Force test pilot following the war. He was one of a handful of pilots who took on the arduous and dangerous task of flying the new jets, including America's first jet, the P-80.
It was an experience for those of us who flew some of those early jets. You see, we had to change engines. Started out at 2 hours, and then we got up to 5 hours and into 10 hours just for the life of the engine. And so there was always maintenance going on with the jets. They didn't have a fuel control, and most people wouldn't understand this, but in starting a jet engine back in those days without a fuel control, you were the fuel controller. And you'd do it like this when you'd start the engine, because if you let if the RPM didn't start moving upward when you were trying to start it, you'd overheat the engine, so you glued your eyes to the tailpipe temperature and the RPM, and it would take you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to get an engine started, because then when you once got it started, to go from idle to taxi speed, you couldn't just put the throttle up. You had to ease it up and ease it back, again, watching the temperature and RPM. And now to get up to speed, engine speed for takeoff, you'd have to sit there and play with it like this again. And now this meant that after you finished your flight and wanted to land, there was no margin for error, because if you found you were too slow or short of the runway, you'd never get the throttle up there to get the power to make you reach the runway.
Something to think about the next time you sink into your seat on an airliner. While assigned to right field, Bob quickly learned that being a test pilot during the day paid certain dividends when he and his friends went out in the evening. On a blind date in Dayton, he met Colleen Humrickhouse. She later said, "The thing that held Bob back was my maiden name. He used to introduce me as Colleen Jones." Her name soon became Colleen Hoover, and it remained so for 68 years until her death in March of 2016. Bob Hoover was a true Southern gentleman. I flew with him on the airshow circuit for so long, and we became such close friends that it was easy to think of him as just one of the guys. It was easy to forget what an important role he played in aviation history. For example, guess who demonstrated the jet airplane to the inventor of powered flight, Orville Wright?
The colonel asked me to take this one airplane, and it was on a test phase, and I put on an aerobatic demonstration for him. And he came over to the airplane. He had some people with him, of course, and I was getting in the airplane, and he shook hands with me and told me he was interested in watching me fly. And then when I came back, why, he congratulated me, and that was just a couple of handshakes, but I was awe-inspired by saying that I'd met the man.
That's just another thing that's a little hard to get your head around when considering the life of R.A. Bob Hoover. He was born just 14 years after powered flight was invented. He personally met Orville Wright. He flew anything and everything for the next 6 decades as a combat pilot, military test pilot, civilian test pilot, and an executive at North American Rockwell, the aerospace company that built the command module for the Apollo moon landing program and the space shuttle orbiters. Bob Hoover painted on a canvas that stretched from Kitty Hawk to the moon. Albert Einstein said, "Intellectuals solve problems. Geniuses prevent them." Preventing problems was indeed the genius of Bob Hoover. As a test pilot, he knew that any problem he discovered could be solved before mass production was begun. In the world of aviation, that meant saving lives. Bob suffered no fools and made no compromises when it came to the hard realities of building safe airplanes and flying them properly. But standing one's ground in test flight often means speaking truth to power, and that can have consequences. One of the issues with the new jet airplanes was that their engines ran on jet fuel or kerosene, not gasoline. That was going to mean setting up a whole new fuel distribution system around the world or finding a way for the jets to fly on gasoline. After several tests of gasoline in the engines, it fell to Bob to perform an aerobatic routine for the Air Force brass. Bob later wrote, "Suddenly at 10,000 feet, the engine flamed out. He survived the crash landing with only very minor injuries." Later that afternoon, he was ready for another flight to test ramjets in a P-51 Mustang. Colonel Albert Boyd, the head of the test flight division at Wright Field, thought otherwise. He ordered Bob out of the airplane. Boyd had counted up the number of forced landings Bob had and found them to be more frequent than other pilots in the division. Though Bob routinely took the riskiest flights, Boyd added, nobody else seems to be having these kind of problems. It was likely the beginning of the end of Bob's Air Force career when he replied, "Well, Colonel, if you'd come down here and fly more often, you could assume some of the risks too." In 1946 and 47, the race to break the sound barrier was on. America's entry was the X-1, built by the Bell Aircraft Company. The project's civilian test pilot, Chalmers Goodland, was scheduled to make the first supersonic flight. There are conflicting accounts as to why he did not. The net result was the news broke at the Wright Field Flight Test Center that the Air Force was seeking a volunteer to break the sound barrier. Several of the pilots, including Bob Hoover, applied. According to Bob Hoover's autobiography titled Forever Flying, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Council had chosen him to make the flight. But then Bob did a favor for a fellow pilot, a favor that changed history.
I was selected for the X-1 program and was asked by a friend of mine who wasn't flying jets, fly over the Springfield airport the first chance you get with the jet, and I'll tell them it was me. That's mistake number one.
In most of the jet test flights, every ounce of fuel was consumed. But on one flight, the weather was so bad, Bob could not get accurate data, so he broke it off.
So I came back and I had a lot of fuel, and there was a Springfield airport underneath. I'll just make a trip across the upside down. I did. The numbers on the side of the airplane were small, and I never thought anything about it. 2 months went by, and I was elated about being selected for the X-1 program. And a new colonel came in, and he said, I just got a letter here saying that somebody buzzed the Springfield airport on such and such a date. Was that you? I said, yes, sir, it was. He said, well, I know 2 things about you. You're honest because there was only one jet that flew in the whole United States that day, and you were in it. But I also know that you're not responsible. He said, you're going to help him out, you're going to live with him, you're going to fly with him, you're going to be his backup pilot. And I thought, oh boy, there were 16 people in that pyramid of candidates to get to that peak I had made. And now I've lost it all.
Of course, history tells us that as a result of Bob's decision, one of aviation's most significant milestones, exceeding the speed of sound for the first time, was accomplished by his close friend, General Chuck Yeager, with Bob flying the chase plane. Interestingly enough, when the Allison Division of General Motors was looking for a chief test pilot and sought the Air Force's advice, Colonel Albert Boyd, the same colonel Bob Hoover had accused of lacking the courage to make the risky flights, told them Bob Hoover was the best in the business, and General Motors recruited him aggressively.
You will be the highest paid 27-year-old in the General Motors Corporation if you accept this job. And they had just lost a pilot, and so I was accepted. And the first thing he said to me is, I'll not only double your pay, but we will give you a brand new Cadillac of any design you want. You can give us the paint job and the interior, and all of the goodies that would spark an interest in any young guy.
So Bob Hoover became a civilian test pilot. And as you might imagine, the kid from Nashville, Tennessee, who purposely made himself sick in order to keep flying, became a legend in that world as well. There was a reason for Bob Hoover to title his book, Forever Flying. It was the tyranny of biology, age alone, that finally dragged him out of the cockpit for the final time. It's kind of funny, but when my generation of pilots encountered Bob Hoover, we didn't think, there's Bob Hoover, the guy who broke out of the prison camp and stole a German airplane. Or there's Bob Hoover, the guy who rescued his friend off a mountaintop by jamming him in a single-seat airplane. Or there's Bob Hoover, who could have broken the sound barrier. Or there's Bob Hoover, who laid healing hands on everything from the P-39 to the F-86, the F-100, the Saberliner, and even the F-18. When I met him, he was just one of us, doing what he'd been doing since he was teaching the teachers in the Tennessee Air National Guard, demonstrating airplanes for people, but with superhuman grace and elegance. Nobody had a touch like Bob Hoover.
Now, the difficult thing to think about is try to pour backhanded to see it on camera. Believe it or not, you can see the horizon going around as the tea is poured into the glass.
He said at times you had to be gentle enough to milk a mouse. And no matter how many offices or neckties they put him in, he always made them agree to let him keep flying. Bob Hoover was an artist, and his inspiration was the unknown.
There's something about the unknown, and that's why I was so disappointed that I didn't get to make the first flight on the X-1. Every day you go out, you have no idea what the rest of the day it has in store for you. And you get used to that. The adrenaline flows, and you get excited about it, and you feel motivated because if you can damage the enemy, that's why you're there. And I had been doing aerobatics, and I was sought after to perform and demonstrate different types of airplanes all over the world. And I enjoyed every one of those flights because they were in different countries and before people that were enthusiastic about flying and wanted to know more about it. And that in itself was another bit of adrenaline flowing, because I can tell you for a fact, you couldn't imagine how many accidents I've seen in my lifetime where the pilots didn't survive.
Bob Hoover's career covered an arc from the Wright brothers and Kitty Hawk to today's space age. His list of personal friends, admirers, and flying mates included Orville Wright, Charles Lindbergh, Jimmy Doolittle, Chuck Yeager, Yuri Gagarin, John Glenn, Neil Armstrong, and hundreds more. And most of them would agree with Jimmy Doolittle. He was the best there ever was. But if we miss the other aspects of Bob Hoover's gift, we miss everything. Courage, both physical and moral, loyalty, integrity. In the wild blue yonder, truth is uncompromising. To Bob, that could not change on the ground. Generosity. Bob never stopped sharing advice, knowledge, inspiration, opportunities. He knew sharing these things could save lives, so he shared them tirelessly. Patriotism. Nobody believed more strongly in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness than R.A. Bob Hoover. And I think something happened to him when he lost his liberty in that prison camp. The sanctity of freedom took up residence in his heart. You took your dignity in your own hands if you failed to properly respect the United States flag or a veteran in the presence of Bob Hoover.
I was enthusiastic. I had high ideals and expectations because I had learned a lot of things about aviation that other people had not had an opportunity to do. I never felt that I was any better than any other pilot. I just felt this is what I want to do, and I want to do it to the best of my ability.
But what made my friend Bob Hoover so special and so important to aviation and the nation was not the gifts he possessed, it was his undying willingness to share them with the rest of us.